What we're finding in the enterprise setting is every enterprise problem is different, and the way you define success is really different across every enterprise problem. Hello, everyone. I'm Sam Denton, and this is Human in the Loop. I'm head of enterprise ML here at Scale, and today I'm joined by my colleagues Felix and Clemens. Felix, you want to do a quick intro?
Yep, I'm Felix. I lead the engineering team on enterprise at Scale. Clemens.
Hi, I'm Clemens. I lead product here for Scale GenAI Platform in the enterprise team at Scale.
Nice. And today we're going to be talking about enterprise evaluations. To kick us off, Clemens, can you start by talking about the different types of enterprise evaluations and what's the difference between sort of traditional model evaluations?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, like when we think about like traditional model evals, most of the time people think about like precise quantitative metrics, precision and recall. There's like a very clear way of like measuring the quality of these models. There's like again, like very metrics driven. With the advent of like GenAI models, which are non-deterministic and they're generating new content, we have moved to like a way more qualitative framework. So like the idea is you need to assess metrics that are like more judgment about like the quality and the safety of like that output. Imagining, for example, like a classification problem in the traditional ML, where it's like pretty clear black and white outcome, you can like determine like what the result is. Whereas like if a GenAI model is producing a report, like assessing the quality of that, even the accuracy might be like significantly more qualitative in nature. On top of that, we of course have this element that like in the GenAI world, we oftentimes embed these GenAI models into agents or larger systems per se. And that means like we don't want to assess only the quality or the output of the model itself, but of the end-to-end system or the agent. So say like there's an agent that is like doing extraction of certain signals from a phone conversation that might involve several steps. Like that takes in the audio input, but then kind of like implements some additional business logic and eventually like produces an output. We want to assess like the overall quality and results of that agent as a system versus like only the individual model and the quality of that. What we generally see on the enterprise side, there's like a lot more focus on trust and safety and responsibility. And that also like leads to this element of like, there's like these two dimensions to evaluation when we think about the enterprise. On the one hand, there's of course like the traditional, maybe like more machine learning driven angle of like, we want to figure out what is actually the quality and like what is going wrong, like where can we make the system better. And on the other hand, there's this element of like, what is the actual quality of the overall solution, in the sense that like, is it ready to actually like be rolled out to prime time and like to be rolled out to production to users, or kind of like after it's being rolled out, like what are kind of like still the elements where the system is failing when it's encountering like real world interactions. So like all of these things in terms of like it being non-deterministic, more qualitative, being more focused on trust and safety, being focused on the entire system, and then also kind of like this dichotomy between kind of like quality of to figure out like what's wrong with the system versus like kind of like is it ready to be rolled out. But like with that kind of like high level setup, Felix, maybe to go one level deeper, you can set us up and like talk a little bit about like how do we implement this in practice? Kind of like how do you set up the eval driven development?
Yeah, we somehow think of agent evals as like somehow different than the normal software development lifecycle that has been going for like, I don't know, decades now, right? So what do you do when you set up like a code project and you want to like deploy it to production, right? You got to pass some unit tests, you got to pass some integration tests, you have to, and that all is set up through your CI/CD pipelines and things like that. And somehow, because AI and agents are here, we somehow are confused and try to reinvent the wheel here, right? I mean, it's like, what do you need to do? You need to, before you deploy your agent in production, you got to pass some eval criteria. It's got to meet a certain bar. Now, the thing that I think freaks everyone out and is confusing is, there's some stochastic behavior. And that's maybe what kind of is confusing. And I think Sam in a second is going to go into some different techniques that we can do to somewhat control that behavior. But the setup is the same from an engineering perspective, right? Like how I would set up the project is you have a CI/CD pipeline, you have eval tests that the agent needs to pass. Those tests are versioned, they're auditable, they have specific things that people can point to if there's failures in the environment. Whenever there's a failure in a production system, you add that as a regression test to your evaluation test suite. So I think it's really important for us to not it's kind of this interesting conversation, not overthink, but also think carefully about the differences, right? The not overthink part is the setup, and the overthink part is how you do the setup, which Sam is going to get into. And I think for all of our customers, a really important aspect of our jobs is education. But Sam, I talked about all this high level stuff. Why don't we get into the details? How do you set up an eval? What does a unit testing with evaluations look like in practice?
Yeah. Thanks, Felix. Yeah, I think Clemens touched a little bit at the beginning on like how eval has changed a lot from sort of traditional ML systems. It's a little bit more qualitative now, right? And you talked a little bit about sort of the infrastructure required for setting up these tests. But then there's this open question of like, what do you fill that infrastructure with, right? What are the actual unit metrics that you populate in? And there are obviously a lot of frameworks out there. There are things like Ragas and like other standardized evaluation suites, truthfulness and groundedness and things like that. But I think what we're finding in the enterprise setting is that those are helpful and they're signals and things, but really like every enterprise problem is different, and the way you define success is really different across every enterprise problem, right? And so I think it does require a little bit of effort at the beginning to figure out what is the business outcome I'm trying to solve? What are the metrics I can use to sort of be guideposts to see that I'm doing things along the right track? Learning to be comfortable with both noisy signals that you sort of trust and then also signals that you really trust, right? And when you think about like these unit tests that you've brought up, Felix, you can sort of think about those unit tests as the signals you really, really trust. But then also you can sort of use things like LLM as a judge and LLM preference ranking and things like that as sort of these noisy signals that you're okay being wrong in its evaluation 5% of the time to make sure that your system is directionally improving, right? And so I talked a little bit about LLM as a judge. Obviously, that's a huge lever to sort of unblock evaluation in some of these sort of more ambiguous situations. I think other things we've seen is that there are certain business outcomes where maybe you're thinking about a customer support situation and you want to make sure that you're evaluating sort of like what percentage of the time you are routing to the right agent in the customer support environment, right? And that is a very sort of like clear quantitative metric that you can track over time and make sure you're improving on. But in order to do that, you have to have a system in place and a platform in place that allows you to sort of capture all the logs, capture when you routed to the right system, and then sort of populate these metrics into a platform where you can track it over time, right? And I think people really underestimate how much of a pain that is, right? Like this is not sort of a trivial like plug and play situation, right? Every enterprise comes with their new metric and their new success criteria and their new sort of definition of what's important, P90, P99. And you need to be flexible enough to be able to sort of look at these logs, look at these traces, figure out where this decision is happening, figure out what your ground truth value is for that situation, and then actually like evaluate it and then populate it into some platform. And that's sort of like what we use SGP for, sort of when we go into these enterprises for delivery, is this like flexible evaluation place where we can take these logs and then populate metrics, right? But it is really hard on a case-by-case basis.
I had a quick question, actually, Sam.
Yeah.
I remember a while ago we were chatting about this, I think sometime last year, where we were talking about auto-eval, and you were like, this is hard. The fact that everyone thinks that you just throw an LLM on here and like ask an LLM to grade another LLM, like this is ludicrous, right? And so I want to know what your biggest learnings were from that experience. What are some of the takeaways that make this like a really hard problem, and what are some pitfalls that people can avoid to prevent falling into those holes?
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I think the best story I have around this is I think this really scares people, but we had a project where I think we probably spent like 2 or 3 months having one ML engineer full-time trying to improve our auto evaluation system for one of our biggest projects. Like that is a non-trivial amount of ML cycles going into just figuring out what is the best possible signal we can gather on evaluation executed by an LLM. And I think when I say that, I think people like assume, well, you can just sort of prompt an LLM and see what happens, right? But if you really want to trust it, you kind of have to iterate on this evaluation flow, right? And so some of the things that we found to be most successful sort of in that space of using LLMs for evaluation are to figure out sort of like what to start with a very small eval set that you really trust and sort of use that to measure your auto evaluator and then sort of scale it up from there. Another thing that we found to be really, really helpful is in-context examples and having really, really high quality in-context examples with also really high quality explanations. Because this sort of gives the LLM some kind of like alignment to what you mean as a human. I mean, rubrics are great and all, but also at a certain point, we're talking about human sort of subjectiveness between what's a 2 and what's a 3 and what's a 4 and what's a 5, right? And so it really requires some really thoughtful in-context examples to help you sort of scale up what you're thinking about when it comes to your rubric for a specific auto evaluation. I think like finally, like we have seen some examples where you can actually train models for auto evaluation and have sort of a separate judge. But I think those are, pretty specific cases where you're looking for something with a really specific quality sort of setup.
Yeah. I mean, like, yeah, it's fascinating what you're describing, Sam, also like how like using agents themselves or like to do evaluation of like other agents. It sounds like very, very meta, but like in that sense, it's really like great how the technology can like leverage itself almost like to improve, even though it's like not a magic. It's not a magic button, and like also like a pretty iterative process, but that's pretty fascinating. I think like one aspect that you haven't really touched upon yet is like what about like the data? So like when we talk to enterprises, like the typical question that comes up is like, oh, what do we actually evaluate on? Like, do we need to come with like a huge golden data set that we need to have ready? Like, what do we like typically see in terms of like, how do we get to basically like a great evaluation data set? I think it's a good topic to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. It is really such a hard problem, right? Is like actually having a data set that you're really excited by, right? So I think like generally our guidance is that it is really, really powerful and really helpful to spend a little bit of time having a thoughtful sort of human data set that has sort of a certain breadth of prompts that you're expecting, a certain breadth of sort of seed, sort of starting tasks and things that you think cover the whole range of what you're hoping for. But I think after that, I think we found a lot of power in scaling up synthetic data sets, right? So what we do is we sort of work with these enterprises to ask them to give us the starting point and then do everything we can to scale up synthetic data sets from there. And sometimes we'll come and revisit those human data sets and ask for a few more examples because we're finding some things in production maybe that weren't necessarily captured there. We can sort of take some of these traces that are happening in production and then put them back into the human evaluation set and have human SMEs go in and sort of say what is the correct answer, what should have happened here. But I think the long answer short is I think it should just be recognized as a separate challenge, right? Is actually creating this data set. And although we do sort of ask for that initial ramp from enterprises to help us get that human data set to really understand the problem, because otherwise I think you're kind of flying a little bit blind without that human evaluation set at the beginning. But I think once it's defined, and it can be pretty limited in scope, then there are a lot of tools that we can use to sort of get this noisy signal that we're hoping for and that we can trust, right? I think from here, one thing that I was interested in sort of pushing forward as a conversation topic was really around like what happens to evaluation from here, right? I think we've sort of talked a little bit about like RAGAS and agents with tool calling, but there's this sort of next evolution of LLM agents coming, right? Where we think about long-running agents that take 2 days to do a task, where you have an agent call out to a bunch of different other agents that all have their own tasks, right? And you want to make sure that you're evaluating this to the best of your ability, but it's also a really complex and long-running situation, right? So Felix, I'm curious how you think about sort of the future of evaluation as we get to these next generation agents.
One thing is like, um, if you run an agent for a short session, let's say it's like a OpenAI chat completion or some even like a AI workflow that does several in a row, you can kind of say, or these are all the decision points that I got to make sure are right, right? The retrieval should be accurate. The AI part should be accurate. If you can decompose your agent into a deterministic set of nodes and graphs, then you can probably come up with a convincing, data set. Now let's explode the problem. Let's say the graph can roll out non-deterministically to any part of the nodes infinitely. You have compounding error rates everywhere. And so how can you really be sure that you've controlled the problem? Okay, sure, I controlled this problem to 75% accuracy. So in a single one session run, it's 75% accurate. But what about 25 times 25, right? Your accuracy rate drops significantly, right? And so I think my opinion of this is that like human in the loop is so critical, like in these sorts of stages. And I think there's going to be a separation between what eval is and what functional running, agents are, right? And eval should be saying, all right, I know this is my graph, right? With a single rollout or a subset of rollouts, I'm going to control each of these individual things. I am going to make still the same things. I'm going to make retrieval 75% accurate. I'm going to make the thing, I'm going to hit the accuracy numbers there. But that's not to say in production it's not going to fail. So then switch to production. You're going to say, let me build my system in a way where when I need to reset my accuracy points, I'm going to offload to a human, right? I gave the example in a previous episode where I was saying my calendar agent went crazy. Like that and started, for those of you who didn't watch that episode, basically like, it started deleting my events and kind of scheduling stuff with C-suite, like probably not a good idea. So putting interjections where you need to say, okay, let me reset, let me get 100% accurate up to this point, reset all my probabilities, let me vet with a human that these are all okay to do. Then gives you confidence to move forward, right? So if my retrieval's at, like I said, 75, which is probably too low, but let's say the retrieval accuracy is at 75%, but then I confirm with a human, I reset my accuracy to 100% because the human said, yes, these are all the right documents. So it's not compounding error rates of 75% all the way through. You're confirming, resetting, and getting back to checkpoints. And to me, this is how humans operate, right? Like if I hire an engineer on my team, there may be like a new hire, I would, say, hey, why don't you go and take care of this thing, right? And periodically along the way, they're going to say, hey, is this right? Hey, is this right? Is there something that I can do? If I just let them run and they're completely new, it's going to be probably, not exactly what we agreed on if they're still learning, right? And so that's kind of like the way I see this is like what you do with eval is in independent checkpoints, can you make sure that those things are good, right? But do they guardrail against everything? No, right? And so that's kind of the way I see things kind of playing out in the future is there's going to be evals and then there's going to be human in the loop. Great name for our podcast. But yeah, maybe you two have your own ideas about it.
One thing that's tricky there, and I like the example of sort of like a new hire, is then if you have this human in the loop sort of like resetting and saying, yep, everything up until that point was correct. What happens with progress when it goes wrong, right? And you say, hey, actually that step was not correct. Do you then have to go and manually do the task for the LLM? Do you then let the LLM try again? Do you let it try a few times maybe so it can learn on its own? Mm-hmm. Do you just give it away the answer? It actually is pretty similar to this concept of like mentorship and sort of like guidance as well. So I'm curious how you think about that. And when do you decide, okay, I really need progress to happen at this point?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it obviously depends on the business use case. There's going to be certain situations where it's got to be like 100% accurate up to certain points. So maybe like finance, for example, you got to get it right. So you would need to exit out and be like, all right, humans, please help complete the task. But there are other things that maybe like can roll out for longer. Like let's say, help me write a document. Like I don't care if you like, I need the document by tomorrow. So if you try 10 times a day, I don't care if it's 10 times or 5 times, as long as it's done by tomorrow. So like you could roll out, right? But this is where I think there's so much opportunity to be had because think about what we just talked about, all this time. We talked about data collection is super important for evaluation. And then, we also didn't really even talk about how do you improve after the evaluation, like taking all the data and, giving it to Sam and be like, hey, great, you got a bunch of labeled data now, fine tune / improve / do all this sort of stuff. Imagine you have an agent that goes off and it just does all these rollouts. And then you get like, binary yes or no from a human, or did this lead to something good or something not? And I think essentially, like, for AI to improve, like the AIs that will improve really quickly are the ones that do get a lot of shots on goal. You get a lot of shots on goal. Tomorrow, Sam wakes up, not only is his document done, but he has like 100 examples where 50 of them were good and 50 of them were bad. I'm sure you could train a model with pretty low sample size if you just let that agent run and you basically only clicked a few buttons and you said approve or deny, right? And to me, the vision of the future is like humans are like executives, right? You sign checks, you say yes or no, and agents are your executors, right? Obviously, I'm oversimplifying a ton of the stuff, but like in reality, like we say in all of our podcasts, like you have to actually go and investigate and do the dirty work of figuring out which paths you have to guardrail and not. But yeah, to answer your original question, like I do think it's important for you to try to let the agent attempt a few times, as long as you are willing to take on that, extra burden of it taking a little bit longer. It'll make the system improve a lot faster.
Yeah. I think like I really love your analogy of like, hiring an engineer and like telling them to do a task, because like we want to think about agents more in this way of like solving problems like humans solve problems like in a much more similar way. Like there's, however, like this whole new dimension of evaluation almost that's coming up. What you kind of like alluded to it, but one of the critical questions is, of course, like to use your metaphor here is like, how do you like instruct your agent or like say your engineer, when should he come to you with a question? You mentioned like, oh, there should be a couple of retries, but like this question of like escalation, or like when does the engineer like ask for help, or like in this case, of course, when does the AI agent actually escalate to a human, and how do we define that interface for that handoff? I know that like at scale, of course, we're doing a lot of research in that dimension as well, but like I'd love to kind of like hear both of you guys' thoughts on like that particular interface between human and machine.
Yeah. And then I found something interesting. Like these models tend to kind of crutch on, oh, let me like ask for confirmation. Let me, and I'm sure you like, even with a decent amount of prompting, they do still often say like, oh, I need to ask somebody or I need to do something. And I think about it, it's like very reasonable. Why? Because all of the applications or most of the applications we see today, a lot of them are chat based. They're short single session based things. And so a lot of the data that we have with the model builders today is like conversational data. Conversational data natively is going to be like biased towards let me confirm or let me ask you. And so they're not as conditioned for these super, super long running things. And so my observation was, like Clemens, you said, ironically, like they ask a lot, too much, in fact. Like, please take care of it, is what I would like to say. And I think, you come up with interesting ways to kind of continue the process, multi-agent systems, actor-critic systems, reward modeling, and there's like a whole bunch of ways. And this is a huge research thing. Back in Amazon, when I was doing robotics, like we had some RL techniques that I would love to try in this space as well. I don't have the answers in terms of what the best way to do it is, but I do know the problems, and so I think it's just a really, really exciting space. You two know that Scale is working on this. We have huge things coming up in terms of planning for this future. I think we're going to get a ton, by the end of this year, even we're going to get a ton of information about how do you make things run for a long period of time with certain guardrails in place. So the podcast in whatever it is, December, that's going to be a really, really good one. So you should tune into that one. But definitely a lot of exciting work to be done. Sure.
Yeah, I think like it's really interesting when you think about like, the question that was just posed of like making sure that the agent raises things to you in the right amount or at the right moments. Like what type of problem is that fundamentally? Well, it's an evaluation problem, right? And then we're back to square zero and we're just starting the podcast over again, right? So I think there's a lot of really exciting work for us to do in this space around evaluation. So I think that's all for today's discussion about AI evaluation in enterprises. If this type of work sounds exciting, we're hiring. Check out our careers page for openings. And then next week, we're doing a red teaming 101 for enterprises. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam.